Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Dr. Christine Miranda, for that introduction. I am very excited to be here with you today. Appreciative of the Latino, Hispanic, and Latino National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center for having me here today. Welcome, everyone. Welcome wherever you are joining us from. I know that there are about 250 people in the audience today, coming from all over the US and different parts of the world. So welcome. I hope that as you're tuning in, that you are healthy and well. I know that we are in the middle of a global pandemic, so I hope that you are in good health and that your loved ones are in good health. My name is Germán Cadenas. My pronouns are he, his, and I am a professor, an assistant professor of counseling psychology at Lehigh University, where I teach in the College of Education in our APA-approved PhD program in counseling psychology and in our master's programs in counseling. And I'm really excited to be here today, as I said, talking with you about how to support the psychological well-being of undocumented immigrants in the US, particularly the needs of those who qualify for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA. And we have an exciting program prepared for you today. But before we get there, I want to share with you a little bit about my background so that you know who I am and where I come from and my positionality when it comes to this issue, so that you have a sense for who's speaking with you today. So I identify myself as a Latinx person. I am of Latin American background, and I am an immigrant myself. Although I now have the privilege of citizenship because I am a naturalized US citizen, I am an immigrant from Venezuela, and I was undocumented for about 9 years during some very formative times and period of time in my life. And that experience of having been undocumented really informs my work, and having lived that experience. And I want to begin by noting that my family and I left Venezuela and came to the US for similar reasons as most people migrate, which are often reasons related to wanting to seek a better life, often escaping hardship, escaping violence, poverty, war, natural disasters, and other hardships that make it very difficult for people to stay in their home country. I do believe that most immigrants migrate somewhere else because they're trying to escape those conditions and they're trying to seek a better life. And that was true for my family. And I was 15 when we migrated. And for my family and I, as it is the case for about 11 million undocumented immigrants in the US, there wasn't a pathway for us to enter what some people call the line, or the immigration system, to be able to adjust our status and have some kind of legal status. There wasn't really a pathway for us to enter. And this is the reason why we have 11 million undocumented immigrants, because the immigration system, unfortunately, is outdated and doesn't account for the needs of many immigrants who come to the US seeking refuge. In order to enter the immigration system to adjust status, there are only a few limited pathways. This includes employment-based migration, based on being sponsored by an employer, and this is usually reserved for people who have very high qualifications, very high skills, what the US considers skilled migration. So these are often folks who have advanced medical degrees, advanced degrees in technology, and these are very, very limited, very strict pathways for migrating. Another pathway for migrating is through the family unification program, which means that a relative, a close family member, may be able to sponsor you. And again, this is very limited, and it's often reserved for immediate family members, such as spouses or such as parents who petition their children. It's a very restricted pathway. Some other avenues for migrating include based on wealth, which means that if someone has a really high amount of money to come and invest and apply to come to the US as an investor, there's a pathway. There may be a pathway for them. Another way is through the refugee and the asylum system, which is also very limited, and there are specific caps by country for who can apply through those. And those who come seeking refuge and seeking asylum often have to prove their case that their life may be in danger if they return to their countries. And often for folks coming from Latin America, and those pathways are very much limited. So anyway, I wanted to share a little bit about my story and to tell you through that some of the limitations within the immigration system and the way that people end up being undocumented. My family and I ended up in Arizona, and I was there as an adolescent and a young adult when Arizona became ground zero for anti-immigrant policy. And they started to pass some pretty anti-immigrant, really harmful legislation. And through that, I became involved in the immigrant rights movement locally and nationally. And that really brought me to immigration as being really central to what I did. I went on to become the first undocumented immigrant who was publicly accepted to a PhD program at ASU. I went on to finish that PhD program. Along the way, I fell in love with somebody who happened to be a US citizen. And I was really privileged that through that, through my spouse, I was able to gain legal status along the way and eventually become a naturalized US citizen. So I do feel very privileged in that I was able to obtain that. This is not the case for most people, as even with a family petition like that, it's on a case-by-case basis. And many folks who are undocumented who try to adjust their status that way may end up having to go back to their countries for an immigration official to review their case there. And I was lucky that I didn't have to go through that process. After receiving my PhD at ASU, I then went to the University of California, Berkeley, where I did clinical work for 2 years. And I was really embedded there in their university health center and their undocumented student program, which is really a model for how to serve undocumented college students. And I learned so much during that time there, serving one of the largest student bodies of undocumented students in the country. And then after that, I moved to Pennsylvania, where I now work at Lehigh University, and my research program very much focuses on the psychology of undocumented immigrants. So to start, I want to ask you a question for reflection. So what does your name mean? And what does it say about your immigration story? If we can take a few moments, and this is for you. What does your name mean? What do you know about your name? And what does it say about your immigration story? What might your name reflect about your immigration story? And so I'll leave you a few moments to reflect on this question. And if anyone feels comfortable, please feel free to enter any reflections, any thoughts, any reactions on the chat, if you would like to share it with the group. What does your name mean? And what might it say about your immigration story?
Somebody wrote, her name means passionate person.
Passionate person. Wonderful. Thank you.
I see people like doing the hand, like raising their hands. You can just write it in the chat or the question box, and I'll just read it as we go along.
Okay.
Selenia said her name means a ray of light.
A ray of light. Wonderful. Thank you, Zendaya.
Well, we have a couple more. I don't know if I'm gonna read this and then you can go on because I don't want to take it too much time. Okay. Pledging soul to a fortress, river of light, a combination of my parents' names, so I carry them everywhere I go. And then some people say that their name comes from France, India, and grace and favor. And someone was named by her abuelita, grandmother.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for reading those. Thank you all for sharing what your name means and what it might say about your ancestors, your immigration story. So there's so much that our name conveys, right? It's such a central piece of our identity. And I heard so many meanings just from what you shared just now. And I'm also hearing that there might be a connection to who named you, maybe where the name comes from, maybe the country of origin, where the name may be from. Maybe there's a connection there between your name and your immigration story. I know that for me, my last name is Cadenas, which for me tells me that there is some kind of Spanish influence, right? There's some influence from Spain, and it also kind of connects me to the experience of colonization in Latin America. That name Cadenas might have meant that I may be a product of colonization and the mixing of European colonizers and the indigenous people in Latin America, in that somehow I am kind of like a byproduct, a descendant of that. Sometimes our names may connect us to some really happy stories, some cultural themes, cultural values that may have been passed down in our families, or it may connect us to other stories and other experiences that may be more painful too. Sometimes when I do this activity, I hear from folks, especially in the Black community, whose history was erased through that process of colonization and slavery, and that's quite painful, right? To think that that you may not have that connection to your name and your immigration story because it may have been kind of taken from you. So I wanted to bring attention to some of those things, the positive and the happy pieces that come with our name, and also some of the maybe painful and sadder pieces that may come from not knowing our history or a connection to our immigration story. I also like to do this activity to sort of connect us all to immigration. We all come from somewhere. If we trace back our migration patterns based on science, based on anthropological evidence, we know that all of us as humans come from Africa, right? Africa is the sort of the crib of humanity, and we may realize that all of us are migrants as a human, perhaps race. That migration and movement have been key to us ending up where we are right now. So who are undocumented immigrants? So undocumented immigrants are about 11 million nationwide. As I mentioned before, often not necessarily by choice, but by necessity, right? People I don't think folks want to be undocumented because it's fun, but because this might be the only choice between hardship and being here undocumented without many legal protections. The majority of immigrants in the country, the 44 million immigrants, the majority of them do have some kind of legal status. So the majority of them are legal permanent residents or naturalized citizens. And about a quarter, that 11 million, are undocumented. Latinx people make up about half of this population. So we are a very significant portion of those who are undocumented. And numbers from Asia and Central America, and particularly from Asia, have been on the rise in the last decade. Asian undocumented immigrants and Asian immigrants overall are the fastest growing number in the US. We make up immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants, make up a very significant portion of the US workforce, and often work as essential workers, right? Working in the farms, working in construction, in the restaurant business, delivering food, driving, doing jobs that are risky, especially now during the pandemic, doing jobs that are highly physical and that demand a certain level of risk. And they're often doing these jobs without the legal protections that they might need to do well and to keep their well-being, often without many workers' rights protections, without paid sick leave, often without health insurance, and often making minimum wage or below, and often having workplace exploitation happen. Of the 11 million, about 700,000, somewhere between 700 and 800,000, are protected by the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, the DACA program, and we'll focus quite a bit on the program today. I'll come back to it. I think that it is also important to note when we talk about immigration and when we work with immigrant communities that immigrant rights and immigrant well-being are racial justice rights and racial minorities' well-being. The sort of the movement for racial justice is interlinked with the movement for immigrant justice. And there's really no way of separating them. And this has been the case because race and immigration have been embedded with each other since the beginning of the US, since the beginning of the country. So if we look at this slide, if we look at the pyramid on the left, we have an example of a caste system, which is the type of ideology that European colonizers brought with them to the Americas. And this is a caste system from Latin America that depicts Spaniards at the top, white folks at the top, and right at the bottom, we have indigenous and African people, and everybody else in between, everybody else mixed, everything else sort of in between. So this is a very dangerous, very harmful type of ideology that was brought to the Americas, and this was the case in the US as well. And this became the foundation of many systems: educational system, legal system, the immigration system. We know that the very first immigration law in 1790 created the concept of citizenship. And I talk about this as someone who has citizenship. So this is the truth that we need to speak. Citizenship was reserved only for free white persons who behaved like a man of good moral character. So we can see here the racial bigotry, right? The racism being embedded within such a central legal construct such as citizenship. Also some of the sexism, right? This was only reserved for men at that time. And then the good moral character piece, who judges, who displays good moral character, white individuals at that time, right? And what this did is it essentially excluded everyone who was already here. So it excluded the indigenous people, it excluded the mixed race people that became Latinx folks in the continent, and it excluded those who were enslaved and stolen from their lands in Africa and were brought here to work and to labor. It excluded them. So it excluded African descendants at the time. And it wasn't until much later that the concept of citizenship began to expand and to include others. So I think this historical perspective is important for us to keep in mind, because we haven't completely rid ourselves from the racism that has been embedded within immigration law, and the ways in which immigration has served as a tool for white supremacy, right? By denying citizenship, it was then sort of ensured that only white immigrants, only white Europeans were able to own land, that only they were able to accrue wealth, that only they would be able to have the legal protections under the Constitution. So really, really harmful, and I think that we're still obviously reeling from this legacy of colonization. We know that these ideas of certain groups being superior than others, particularly white supremacy, made their way into science, and particularly into psychological science in the 19th and even in the 20th century, through social Darwinism, the movement for eugenics. We know that there are issues with how tests have been used with communities of color, including immigrants in the past. And so even within our mental health fields, our health fields, our education fields, we have been impacted by this systemic racism being embedded. And when we look at immigration policy through history, we know that it has been applied in much more aggressive ways towards immigrants of color, with legislation such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment camps, the Wetback program, the construction of the border wall, which actually began in the 90s, and so on. So it is often, I think, humbling to speak about this history and to have this awareness as we prepare to work with immigrant communities and to support their mental health and their well-being. We're seeing the products of this historical racism playing out today. There have been so many changes to immigration policy since 2017. They have been coming at a really, really rapid rate, including separation of families at the border, and multiple attempts at a travel ban. Most recently, a ban on international students. Hopefully it didn't come to fruit, but nonetheless it sent a message, right, to so many international students here in the US, and many more policy changes that we won't have time to cover today. But it's been overwhelming to see that many policy changes. This includes the attempts to end the DACA program, which again shields about 700,000 undocumented immigrants from deportation. So it's important, I think, to keep track of some of these policy changes, to understand the context, as well as the historical context, to link it to psychological distress and psychological well-being. These multiple changes in immigration policy certainly have an impact on the way that immigrant communities feel, the way that they function, the way that we function. Certainly it creates quite a bit of fear, of anxiety, of sadness, depression, and there's quite a bit of research supporting that, and we'll get into that a bit more in a second. But before we move on, I just want to ask you to, for a moment, to do an internal scan and pay attention to how you're feeling in this moment, any emotional reactions, any physiological reactions, as we hear about the sociopolitical context and also the historical context of immigration. And I won't ask you to share it, but if you could just do an internal scan just for yourself. So the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, was created by President Obama by executive action in 2012. And the program is a temporary protection. It is not a permanent legal status. It's a temporary protection for undocumented youth to be able to stay in the country without fearing being removed, being detained, and being deported. And it was designed as a temporary measure until Congress passed some kind of permanent solution. And in order to qualify for the DACA program, undocumented youth have to meet a number of very strict requirements, such as not having a criminal record or having entered the US by a certain age, and really, really strict requirements. About a little bit over 700,000 undocumented youth were able to qualify. Most of them were young adults, late adolescents, many of them who wanted to go to college. Sometimes they're referred to as dreamers. Sometimes they don't like to be referred to as dreamers. Some of them do. And the program was really successful in that it really helped many undocumented youth have some kind of peace of mind to stay in the country, to go to school, to be able to work, and also was really successful economically in terms of undocumented immigrants who qualify for the program being able to find better jobs, buy homes, buy vehicles, and so on. And so it was a really successful program. In 2017, there was an attempt to end the program, and the program basically froze. So there have been no new applications to the DACA program since 2017. The lawsuits to protect the program eventually made it to the Supreme Court. In June of this year, the Supreme Court ruled that the program has to stay, that the current administration cannot end the DACA program. And this was a huge relief in the immigrant community, knowing that that DACA recipients could continue to be protected. But the current administration continues to fight the program and is continuing to try to end it through different ways. And they're not accepting new applications into the program. So the DACA program is still very much in limbo. And what we have here is a video of some of the reactions from DACA recipients when the program was almost ended in 2017.
What does it feel like to be a dreamer today? Today, I was kind of having a bit of a mental breakdown at work, trying to focus and to stay on top of my usual job. It was not a good day. I actually left early because I heard the news and I just couldn't take it too much.
For me, to have DACA today feels very uncertain. But I've always known that DACA is not a permanent solution for my situation in this country.
Well, the ability to have DACA obviously has opened many doors for us. Many small things that some people take for granted, which is the ability to have a driver's license, the ability to go hang out with your friends or to go out to dinner without having to get worried about getting pulled over by a cop, being arrested, and then deported.
Well, my whole life, I went to school, high school, everything. I didn't realize that I didn't have papers. I didn't, that I was not part of this country until it was time to apply for college. And I realized you cannot receive financial aid. It was life-changing. It gave me the independence that I now have to support my family.
It feels like safety. Something just to make sure that I'm not taken away and that I'm here.
When I first got DACA, I was very excited.
It affected me. It was one of the happiest days of my life.
I wake up to about 30 text messages, maybe 100 emails.
My mom called me and she was crying, I think, and she told me that there was a way for me to be like normal like everyone else, and I knew immediately what she was talking about when she said be normal like everyone else.
I have lived here since I was 6 years old. Yes, so my whole life.
I've lived here in Houston for 18 years.
Since I was 10 years old.
I've lived here since I was 7, so about 17 years.
I do not have any memories of El Salvador, which is where I'm from, and this is the only place I know as home.
Well, I'm getting married in December. Hopefully that still happens. Maybe 2, 3 kids. She was 2, but I went 3. So we'll see. Just, having the luxury to travel and still educating kids because I'm a teacher. So that's a big, big part of what I still want to do in my future.
It's a very sad day for us today, but I feel more strengthened than before to continue my education. I will actually receive my bachelor's degree in healthcare administration in December.
To be honest, I'm a little panicked right now. I actually recently got married, and there's no way right now for me to fix my situation other than DACA was my fix for my problems at the time, and now I have nothing to fall back on. I bought a house and I'm trying to pay it off, and I'm like, is it even worth to pay off my house at this point? And like, is my credit score even of value anymore to me? You know what I'm saying? It's like a lot of things that I've worked so hard to acquire, and at this point, I'm like, was it even worth it? Should I be getting ready to be deported or just I'm not even sure how to get ready for these things, to be honest.
Today I'm not letting my spirits go down. I am not. They have taken everything from us today, but we're strong people and we will always move forward. I'm ready to fight for my dreams, for my life. So I feel propelled, and this is the fuel that I needed.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed the video and listening to the stories. I hope you are having a reaction to some of the stories and that you're seeing the real impact, right, of ending a program like DACA and the real life consequences of immigration policy. Having your life being in limbo, and how difficult this can be. So I want to share with you some recent data from some research and national studies. So on the left there, you can see some data from college students that we analyzed from all over the country, and we separated students based on their immigration status into 3 categories. So one category was students with permanent status. The second category was the students with no permanent immigration status, so undocumented, DACA recipients, students who have some objectivity in their immigration status. And then we had student visas, international students. And what we found is that across the board, it was pretty clear that there were significant differences, where those who were undocumented had higher symptoms of depression, higher symptoms of anxiety. They perceived their climate on campus to not be as welcoming of diversity. They didn't feel as welcome on campus. They experienced higher discrimination. They experienced lower positive mental health. But luckily, they did actually have higher sense of ethnic identity. So this kind of gives us a sense for just how the climate and the changes in immigration policy and just everything that has been happening for the past few years are impacting the mental health and the well-being of undocumented and DACA college students. On the right-hand side there, what we have is a model of coping that we created and we tested on undocumented college students. The majority of them were DACA recipients. And what we found is that experiencing higher levels of everyday discrimination on campus were linked to higher experiences of anxiety. And so more discrimination led to feeling more anxious on a daily basis. However, developing a higher sense of critical agency to be involved in political ways, addressing systemic oppression through activism or through advocacy, including self-advocacy. That's what we call critical agency, as well as higher vocational outcome expectations, maintaining higher vocational goals, trying to stay in school and trying to graduate, that those 2 things served as coping mechanisms for undocumented students during this time, and that they helped buffer the effects of everyday discrimination. So those students who were more agentic about their ability to engage with sociopolitical systems, and those who try to maintain a higher level of vocational goals, they were able to cope with everyday discrimination and protect their mental health. And so this is important for us as mental health providers, as educators, because it gives us a sense for where we can focus with all of this, right? All of this highly stressful climate, and these very harmful policies. It gives us a sense for how we can help students by supporting their advocacy, their activism on campus, supporting them and advocating for them, and also helping them maintain a high sense of vocational outcome expectations, high sense of educational goals. So how do we foster critical consciousness among undocumented and DACA students? And so we know that from research that among immigrants, including undocumented students, critical consciousness is linked to higher political agency, higher educational outcomes, and that it can be a coping mechanism, as I just mentioned. Providers can help in many ways. We can help students identify the impact of systemic oppression on their psychological well-being. And by doing this, we can help them challenge the internalization of some of those negative, oppressive messages that they may receive through policy or through the media about immigration. And we can help them connect what they're feeling, their psychological distress, their physiological distress. We can help them connect that to the climate. so that they know that there's nothing wrong with what they're experiencing. I'm trying to help them contextualize this. And we can support them in developing behavioral coping skills, such as creating self-advocacy plans and connecting with the community, helping them become more connected with different groups, organizations, cultural institutions, and so on. This is a model that I find really helpful in working with undocumented and DACA students. And I think it can be a really good place to start for providers to try to develop our multicultural and social justice practices, to develop our multicultural and social justice competencies. And this model, if we look at from the top down, we see that there's a line, there's sort of a spectrum from privileged in the counselor or the provider, educator, and the marginalized counselor or educator. So what this basically says is thinking about the ways in which we ourselves as providers might experience marginalization or oppression. So for me, for example, I know that I have privileges related to being a cisgender male in this society, or being a white adjacent Latinx, right? Where sometimes I may benefit from white privilege. Having a high level of education gives me some social class privilege, and having the privilege of citizenship. So I know that these privileges play a role when I come into counseling or when I come into the classroom and work with immigrant communities. I've also experienced marginalization as somebody who is an immigrant, who is formerly undocumented, who is a Latinx. I'm also the subject of racism, and having grown up low income, I have experienced quite a bit of class marginalization. And so I know that those experiences also play a role in working with undocumented communities. In fact, some of those experiences might be strengths in working with this community. And then this model tells us to consider the ways in which the client is also privileged or marginalized in similar ways. And to consider the way that may influence the relationship and the dynamic in the therapeutic session or in the classroom in education. So I highly recommend that model. Another model that has been helpful is the APA Multicultural Guidelines, which we applied through the California Psychological Association. We applied these guidelines to make recommendations for how to work in psychological practice with undocumented immigrants. And those recommendations were approved in 2018. And these recommendations are based on liberation psychology, which I find to be really useful in working with communities that experience marginalization, which is many communities, right? And liberation psychology says that it sort of helps us understand what social oppression and social marginalization do in terms of mental health well-being, psychological well-being, and how to recenter our approach, recenter our practice, so that it focuses on that marginalization and that oppression. So I'll leave that there for anyone who would like to read it. You can find these recommendations online if you would like to read them in more detail. Okay, and the next video I'd like to show you is about immigration being love. Sometimes we hear quite a bit about the trauma and the challenges, the barriers, the really difficult experiences that immigrant communities face, and all of those are true, and I'm glad that we talk about those. But we don't often hear enough about the joy and the positive experiences and the resilience in these communities. And so I want to show you this video, which highlights a little bit of both.
The big time
We're gonna be famous.
Hollywood.
Hi, I'm Nakia, and I'm a citizen.
My name is Humberto, and I got that.
I don't think people think that undocumented immigrants look like me just because I have blue eyes and I'm white. They think they all look the same.
Yeah, they look like me.
That we were friends for a year. For freshmen in high school, like really awkward. Yeah. Like, what kind of pickup line do you have as a freshman in high school?
So we first met when we were resident assistants.
We were outside of a bar.
But I remember all the girls thought he was cute.
Yeah.
But what caught like my attention was your red hair. It was like Weasley red. Yeah. Like, it was very, very red.
But it was your eyes, and I remember it was that, and that was the first thing that physically attracted me to you.
Ultimately, you know, she is my best friend.
You always have goals, you're always dreaming, and there's things that you always accomplish, everything that you want to do and just accomplish.
I think the moment that I really realized that I was in love was actually right when she found out that she was undocumented. We were only 15. Just the idea that she might not be around, that someone might take her away.
The night that I got really scared, I think it was seeing the Republican debate, and all of them, except for one, said that they would eliminate DACA.
It was really powerful, and Victoria started crying because she didn't know what was going to happen to me.
The laws like that are in place and stuff really have affected different parts of our relationship. I think especially because of like different like power dynamics at play, since like I'm a citizen and he's not a citizen.
This has been so far about an 11-year process. A lot of people don't realize that it takes a lot of money, that you need a lot of paperwork, that you need a lot of time.
For years, you know, she would tell me that if this was too much for me to handle, that like I could walk away and she would understand. Because no one signs up to be undocumented, and no one signs up to have a partner who's also undocumented, and then deal with all those like legal issues and, you know, the pressure, like the fear of it, you know.
I don't like that. It makes me feel like I'm a burden.
You're not hurt.
I fell in love with you, and I didn't know you having DACA, you not having papers, didn't determine how I felt for you. I would love you whether you had papers or not. So for me, immigration is love.
What a positive message, right? Immigration is love. Immigration is love. So right now, I want to, again, ask you to take a moment to do an internal scan and to pay attention to any emotional reactions, any feelings you're having right now after having watched this video, and any physical reactions, any tension, or paying attention to the way that you're sitting. Maybe you're sitting a little bit more comfortably now after hearing some of the stories of love, but also the way that love that is a little bit more complicated when someone is has an undocumented immigration status. Okay, so moving on, we might not have time to get into the case. I have prepared a case for us to work on together. We might not have enough time to get into it, but if anybody would like to read it, you can read in the handout. This is from a chapter that we wrote that was published in a book for educational leaders that came out last year. And it's a compilation of many cases that myself and my colleagues have worked with, have stories that we've listened to, and we try to compile them into one nuanced case. And I'll let you read it on your own, but it highlights some of the difficulties that some undocumented youth, undocumented college students sometimes can feel. But let's come to a little bit more of what we can do as providers to support this community, right? Building on the historical awareness, building on the awareness of the policies, the current sociopolitical context, having explored our privilege and the way that it may manifest in session or in the classroom, and having gone over some multicultural guidelines, there are some more specific things that we can do as providers. And these come from our guide that we published in April, and it's available online. The link for the guide is there on the handout on the slide, if you would like to go through each of the 10 steps in detail. But the first step that we thought would be important, and by the way, the guide was written by mental health providers who all of us are immigrants. And at least I think the majority of us had been undocumented or are current DACA recipients. So this guide is very much from the community in many ways. We also shared this guide with a group of DACA recipients to receive their feedback, and we incorporated the feedback before we published it. So the first step on the guide is to center our work on the stories, on the narratives of DACA recipients. And this means that if we're working with an undocumented person, maybe spending some time outside of session, becoming familiar with the narratives. So watching videos like the ones that we watched today. There are many other good documentaries out there, many stories that have been written on many books, blogs, news articles, and trying to get a sense for the themes that arise from these stories, so that once we're working with the undocumented community, we might have become sensitized, and we're not reacting in shock to the real life experiences. Once we're in session and once we're working with the community, it's important to remember that they are the experts of their story, that they know their experience better than anyone else, and to remind them of this, that we are not the experts, we're there to support them. And also to try not to rely on them to educate us about the process of immigration. They can share their experience, but that shouldn't be we shouldn't rely on them to educate us on other things that maybe we might be better off learning on our own, such as the changes in immigration policy and so on. Telling the story can be really empowering. Sharing your story can be really cathartic. And this in and of itself can be a big intervention, right, to use in counseling and in psychotherapy. It's also important to remember that not all DACA recipients, not all undocumented students or immigrants are out in public with their story. It's a big risk to share the stories, and they might not even want to share parts of their immigration status with you as a provider. So it's always good to proceed with caution and to allow them to bring immigration, not bring it up yourself. And if you are to ask about immigration status, to do it in a way that is conversational, that is paying attention to power dynamics, so that you're never interrogating someone about their immigration status, and that you're never demanding their immigration status, and that you don't use your position of power to make someone afraid about their immigration status. So following the client and allowing the client to speak about their story and their immigration status on their own terms, facilitating that empowerment. The second step on our guide is to explore the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, to assess this in session. We know that the pandemic has changed all of our lives, right? Nothing is normal, nothing is the same anymore. And particularly in immigrant communities, we know that the pandemic has had a disproportionately negative effect on communities of color. Most immigrants to the US are people of color. So we know that our immigrant communities are hurting, not only in terms of health, because of health disparities and gaps in health access, but also economically. The Latinx community has had probably the worst impact economically in terms of the pandemic. And so assessing this in session, and understanding the way that for a particular undocumented person, the pandemic has had an impact. The third step is to learn the basics of immigration policy, learning the basic of how the immigration policy system works, and finding a way to stay attuned to changes. And so today we did go over some basics of the immigration system, some of the historical perspective, and this is something that is really key as providers, so that we're not relying on undocumented clients to educate us about these things that sometimes they might not even understand themselves. I don't fully understand it. Sometimes the immigration system is really complicated. It takes a lot of legal, I think, resources and educational privilege to understand it. And so doing some of that homework on our own, I think, is helpful. We may wish to sign up for updates from immigrant rights groups or legal clinics, so that whenever there's a policy change, we can get an email, we can get some kind of alert that tells us what a policy change means. The fourth step is to identify and challenge our own biases and misconceptions about immigrants. So if we go back to the beginning of the presentation today, we know that racism and racial bias are deeply, deeply embedded into the fabric of everything. And this inform the biases and misconceptions about immigrants. There's quite a bit of misinformation out there about immigrants and undocumented immigrant communities. So something that we can do as providers is to try to ask ourselves what we know about undocumented immigrants and where these ideas might have come from, and perhaps do some research and some homework to try to see how much of this is factual and how much of it we can challenge. And this is an ongoing process to challenge these biases and these misconceptions. And I think that doing this helps us in having more positive attitudes towards undocumented and DACA clients, and also keeps us from coming into session and microaggressing our clients. And so perhaps making this a routine part of what we do regularly to challenge these biases and misconceptions. Number 5 is to review existing models and recommendations for clinical work with immigrants. And we've done some of that today. We reviewed the recommendations that come from the California Psychological Association and some other models that may be really helpful in working with this community, including liberation psychology and including the social justice multicultural model. The 6th step that we identified is to integrate trauma-informed care and multiple competency in our clinical style. And this is key, as we've heard from the narratives, the videos, as we have seen from the research. The immigrant community experiences trauma and multiple forms of trauma sometimes. Sometimes the migration process itself, the conditions that led to migration, so the pre-migration conditions, the migration piece, whether the way that someone arrived to the US, and then the post-migration experience. All of those 3 sort of moments can be traumatic for many clients. And so trying to understand and learn about different strategies for trauma-informed care and to bring this into our work with immigrants. Something that I found really helpful in my work with undocumented students when I was practicing at UC Berkeley was to incorporate mindfulness into my clinical work. Whenever I saw that a student was becoming distressed, nervous, really upset, I would try to slow down the session for a moment and bring the attention to the breathing and incorporate a breathing exercise, some mindfulness exercise to try to tackle the nervous system and try to ground the person. The 7th strategy is to focus on strategies that foster psychological strength and behavioral coping strategies. So these may involve applying our psychological intervention style, using cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative therapy, whatever your go-to preferred style is, adapting that to help develop new coping strategies. And to do this with sensitivity to the context and sensitivity to the cultural experiences of undocumented immigrants. And that brings us to our 8th step, which is to recognize that immigrants have an inherent wisdom and resilience as much as they have trauma, and that they already have coping strategies, they already have ways of being that have been helpful to them and that have helped them through some very difficult times, including the migration experience if it was traumatic for that individual. And so bringing attention to that in session and trying to highlight that and to bring awareness so that the client can understand that they already possess many skills, many strengths, and that they're not deficient in any way. Number 9 is helping connect with community resources, with organizations that provide legal support, educational programs, financial help, health services, advocacy, and activist groups. And so working with undocumented students, undocumented clients may require for us to step outside of the therapy room, step outside of the classroom a little bit more to connect with other resources in the community, national resources, and gather them so that we can provide them whenever they are needed by our undocumented clients. And then number 10 is about engaging in continuing education, supervision, consultation, and professional support, knowing that competence is a goal, but it's always evolving, and we don't have to do it on our own. Hopefully we can find a community of supervisors, of peers, of other providers who are also working with the same community, and that we can learn from, and we can support each other in doing this kind of work, so that we can prevent some burnout in ourselves as providers. So as I mentioned, working with undocumented communities might require us to do a little bit more work outside of the classroom or the psychotherapy session, and this might involve advocacy. And I found this model from the American Counseling Association to be particularly helpful in helping me think about and understand the ways that as a provider, I can advocate in collaboration with the community, and also on behalf of clients, students, and the community. And I think it's great that the model goes from the micro level, the individual level, the counseling session level, all the way to collective action, collective demonstrations, and social and political advocacy, meeting with our Congress people, writing to our Congress people, and asking them to change immigration policy so that it becomes more humane, and it doesn't cause as much harm as it does in the present. And here I have some examples for what collaborating for empowerment, legal services, and advocacy can look like. I think the model at the University of California at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, their undocumented student program is really a model for how to provide holistic services to undocumented students. And this includes legal support, this includes mental health, psychotherapy, this includes mental health education, academic advising, financial support, and so on. They really have really figured out a way of providing all of these holistic services in a way that is grounded in the community, in that it follows the needs of the students on campus. So it's never a top-down approach. I also wanted to bring attention to United We Dream, which is the UWD there at the bottom. This is the largest network of undocumented immigrants in the country, the largest advocacy network, and they do some fantastic work. They have an UndocuHealth initiative that many psychologists from the National Latinx Psychological Association, we have been supporting them in developing this UndocuHealth initiative, and it's really fantastic. So I invite you to look at what they do, to become involved if you would like to get updates from them, and to also see their UndocuHealth resources, which I think are terrific. And then on the top right, we have the Informed Immigrant Platform. And the Informed Immigrant Platform, which is also in Spanish and Espanol, is a compilation of resources for immigrant communities. And this includes finding legal services that are pro bono or low bono across the country. Simply by tapping a zip code, one can find an organization that provides this kind of services. And there are many resources for the community directly, and also for providers. So for anyone who's looking for more resources, more support, there's a listing of resources there, including our guide that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so with that, let's open it to questions. So yeah, I invite you now to type your questions. And I think we have about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Calinas. We have a couple of comments and questions. The first one says, has there been any research on children who are now of age to petition their parents, and how is this impacting them? I treat parents who are requesting this from their children, and I also see young adults who are being asked this.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's I think that's an important that's a really important question. I'm not aware of any research that documents that experience, but what I know from having worked with the community is that it's really complex, right? Being a child of immigrants who may have the privilege of citizenship. Often immigrant children and children of immigrants, because of the way that they navigate acculturation and enculturation, in terms of being able to learn the language quickly, being able to learn the systems quickly, and being able to adjust and navigate the systems in this new receiving country. They are in an interesting place where they play a role of sort of, sometimes they might play a role of, I don't want to say that this is everyone's experience, but they might be in a position where they play a role of being the cultural sort of agent for the family, where sometimes they might need to translate for the family, interpret on behalf of the family, sometimes explain things to the family, because things might be quite different from the way that the family and the parents might be used to from their home countries. And so, so children of immigrant children can play a really, I think, protective and strength kind of based role in their families in helping them adjust and navigate. And this also comes with more stressors, right? Being sometimes put in parentified roles, in which they might need to mature and kind of grow up much faster in order to be able to kind of assume these roles within the family, including perhaps needing to petition a family member, a parent, a sibling, yeah, I think that it's a little bit of both. It comes with it might come with pressure and stress, right? It's there's so much power that comes with being in that position in the family, of being the one who can petition someone so that they can adjust their legal status, and at the same time, it can be a really kind of protective and important role. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the answer. I saw a comment here. It says, "This is so true. Even though I'm working as a clinician, my experiences of the immigration laws help me to provide a better support to my clients." And then somebody asked about a website you were just talking about for legal resources by zip code. Like, if you could repeat the name of the website.
Absolutely. And to the person who commented just before, thank you for that comment. Yeah, I do think that as a provider, you can be really supportive, and you can really be in a position to truly support people in your community. So thank you for that comment. For the website is informedimmigrant.com. It's informedimmigrant.com. And it's the website here on the top right, the green looking website. I have a screenshot of that there. So it's Informed Immigrant. And it's also—
We cannot see it. I'm not sure if you're showing it. Oh, there you go. There you go.
Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's also in Spanish. And you can just go to where it says find legal help, and they have compiled a number. This is probably like the most robust list that I've seen of legal services. They've also been compiling services related to COVID. Undocumented communities were left out of the stimulus package, so they didn't receive any of the stimulus money, right? That I think the rest of us received. Like we received a little bit of funding from the government to respond to COVID. Undocumented immigrants were left out of that package. And there have been funds that have been popping up around the country to provide financial support to undocumented communities. And Informed Immigrant has also compiled these resources, and they're on the website.
Thank you. That's a great resource. And I saw some people asking about the handout on the panel. Everyone can download today's handout. And if by any means you need the handout on your, email us and I'll make sure to attach the handout, because I know sometimes people have trouble downloading it. With that said, our next question says, I was wondering if there were any suggested immigration nonprofits / advocacy groups that we could find to keep us updated on immigration policies.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that folks are asking that question. Yep. So United We Dream is an organization that I highly recommend. They are the largest network of immigrant youth, undocumented, and they've been working for the DREAM Act, for DACA, for immigration policy for over a decade. And they are led by undocumented youth. So I highly recommend them. United We Dream. They have many resources there too. And I mentioned earlier that they have something called the Undocu-Health Initiative, which has many mental health resources too, that a group of psychologists, we have been collaborating with them and helping them shape some of that initiative. So that's one organization, United We Dream. Another organization is Forward.us. That's FWD.us, FWD.us, Forward.us, and they're an advocacy organization. They've also been fighting to protect DACA, and they work with higher education. They work with technology leaders. They do a lot of work with groups at the border, and I think they're a really good group to follow as well.
Thank you. And I just copy every link you just mentioned on the chat, so that's easier for the attendees. So you have
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
I'm sorry. My connection just went down. I just came back. Sorry for that.
No problem, no problem. I thought it was my connection. So I was like, oh no, what happened?
Yeah, I was in the middle of saying that everything was on the chat for everyone. And let me just make sure I go on and read our next question. Okay, and then you already sort of answered this one. We're having a couple of questions on like staying up to date with immigration policies, but I think we just covered that well. Okay, next question says, do you recommend any specific books regarding DACA or immigration in general?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, many books. One of them, I think the great book is Lives in Limbo. Lives in Limbo by Dr. Roberto Gonzalez out of Harvard. And Dr. Gonzalez has been working really closely with undocumented students for, I think, for like 1 or 2 decades. And he's been documenting their stories and their struggles and doing this really great research that is really embedded in the community and in the narratives. And he's put a lot of that in this book called Lives in Limbo. It's an excellent book. Yeah, I highly recommend it. Yeah, I have this book with me, the Racial Healing book. I highly recommend by Dr. Singh. It's not specific to immigration, but I think in the moment that we're living with being in such a pivotal, I think, moment in history of racial justice awakening, I think it's important to bring that into our work in immigration and the Racial Healing Handbook. I think it's a great resource.
Thank you, and I just added those again on the chat just to make it easier for everyone. And I'm gonna go ahead and read the last question. It says, as part of your guide to provide mental health services to immigrants, does the trauma-informed section include a discussion on intersectional identities, like queer identity, for example, and best practices?
That's an excellent question. That's a really excellent question. So one thing about the guide that we were intentional with was making sure that it was practical. And so throughout the guide, there are multiple links to go to different resources and read more about what's available there. And so that includes the trauma-informed piece. So please read it, and you'll see many resources related to trauma-informed care. Intersectionality, I think, is a really helpful framework. And we wrote the guide with that in mind. And I don't know that we named it explicitly, but we're keeping in mind that the experiences of undocumented immigrants are not a monolith, that they are complex, and that they are informed by multiple systems of oppression that may intersect and may collide to further complicate the experiences. And I think some of that is what I was kind of hinting at when we looked at that model of privilege versus marginalization, that in some of our identities and in some of the identities of the clients, we might experience privilege, and in some other identities, we might experience marginalization. And so, yeah, so it is helpful as providers to keep this in mind, that for somebody who's undocumented, and also who identifies as a female, who might be queer, who might be of Black ancestry, who might be diagnosed with a disability. That all of these things sort of collide to further complicate, further marginalize the experiences, and bringing this awareness into our clinical work, I think is helpful. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you so much for all the resources. As I said before, everything's on the chat. So if you have any questions regarding a book title or anything like that, I've added everything on the chat. And with that said, I want to thank Dr. Cadenas once again for today's presentation. It was definitely a great presentation, and we received a lot of great comments on the videos that you showed. So I know that our attendees enjoyed all the information that you gave us today. I don't know if you want to say something before we go.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who listened today. I appreciate you. And if I can be a resource, feel free to contact me anytime. And thank you again for having me. And thanks for all the questions.
Thank you. And as a reminder, once we close the webinar, you're going to be redirected to the survey and the post questions. So please make sure you guys fill that out, because it helps us to keep on bringing great presentations as the one we just had. And also a reminder that we're going to have a recorded version of this webinar as well. So be on the lookout for that. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.